Good morning. You're listening to Short Stories with Mrs. Sam, brought to you by the Hotchkiss Library of Sharon and Robin Hood Radio. Tune in every week on Sunday at 8:30 a.m. to WHDD 91.9 FM to catch our show. My name is Mrs. Sam. I'm the children's librarian at Hotchkiss Library of Sharon. We have all sorts of wonderful books there for children of all ages, and lovely virtual crafting and story times besides. Soon, the weather will be warm enough for us to have some outside library programs. You can find information on all the events we hold for children and adults alike on our website, hotchkisslibraryofsharon.org, or on our Facebook page, facebook.com/hotchkisslibrary. We are open by appointment for browsing and borrowing and computer use every day of the week. And now, without further delay, let us blast off into this week's short story. More this week from author Richard M. Elam. The Space Mail Run. The way he felt now, Jerry Welsh was almost sorry he had left Earth. The moonship landing seemed to be crushing the very life out of him, although he lay flat on a couch to ease the strain. Jerry turned his head toward his father, who was strapped down like himself and suffering too. The craft was under its own control, for no human could withstand the rocket's present speed and still be able to steer in for a landing. Captain Welsh was on his bi-weekly mail run to Luna, the moon, and for the first time in 10 years of service he had a passenger, his own 12-year-old son. At last Jerry felt a hard jolt under him. He knew the rocket's tail fins had finally touched ground. Jerry unstrapped himself with rubbery fingers and sat up. Then he tried to stand, but he flopped down again. "Whoa, I feel giddy," he groaned. His father laughed. "You'll get your bearings presently, son." How long Jerry had waited to make this space mail run with his father. Finally, last year, Captain Welsh had said that Jerry could go with him when he became 12, as he was especially husky and strong for his age. But now that the great moment had come at last, Jerry wasn't sure he was enjoying it as he had expected, for he had found space so vast, so dark, and so frightening. "Do you still want to be a spaceman, Jerry?" his dad asked suddenly, as though Jerry had spoken his thoughts aloud. I think so, Dad," he replied hesitantly. "I see you're doubtful, Jerry," Captain Welsh said. "I won't put you on the spot so early." They climbed into space gear, electronically heated suits, and clear plastic helmets fitted with radios. Lastly, they donned oxygen tanks and flooded their suits with the life-sustaining gas. They gathered up the mail sacks and climbed down the ladder to the ground, heading for the largest group of buildings which made up Moonhaven, center of Earthmen's activity on the airless planet. The stars burned fantastically bright overhead. Traces of frost topped the distant lunar Alps. It was incredibly cold out here, for the moon was in its 2-week period of night. Captain Welsh got a receipt for the largest mailbag, and then he and Jerry went out a rear door of the building, carrying the rest. An atom-powered mail car awaited them. It had an open top and huge wheels that looked like sawtooth gears. "Climb aboard the moon jeep, Jerry," his father said. "We've got 10 mail deliveries to make." Inside, Captain Welsh pulled down a section of the dash panel, revealing a map. "Here's a map of our route. There aren't many mail stops on the moon yet, but they're all important." "And the mail must go through," Jerry added. Captain Welsh nodded soberly. "That's the first law, Jerry." As they moved off, Jerry saw the big friendly globe of Earth hanging like a green jewel halfway up the jet-black sky. He wondered what his mother and baby sister were doing this moment, 250,000 miles away. Captain Welsh showed Jerry how to run the jeep. Jerry found this easy, for he had already had a course in mechanics in preparation for his future career as a spaceman. But some time later their peaceful ride was interrupted, when Captain Welsh suddenly leaned over and grabbed the wheel. Jerry was thrown to the side as the car swerved. The vehicle straightened out and slammed to a halt as his father controlled the wheel and applied the brakes. "What happened?" Jerry breathed, his heart pounding. His father pointed behind them. "Look." Jerry turned and saw the edge of a treacherous ditch running right across the roadway where they would have passed over. The gorge was several feet wide. "I didn't even see it," Jerry murmured, sick with fear at what might have happened. This wasn't the first time he'd been shaken on this journey. It made him wonder, as he once before, if he had what it took to be a spaceman, or if this adventure would make him decide never to leave the atmosphere of Earth again. "Scared?" his father asked. Jerry nodded. "Don't worry. I was too for a moment." "You were?" Jerry asked with surprise. "Fear was given to man so he could save himself from danger, Jerry," Captain Welsh said. "Don't be ashamed of it. Fear is nothing to be ashamed of, unless you let it get the best of you. Never forget that." They arrived at their first delivery point, an engineering project on a plateau surrounded by mountains. There were the foundations of great buildings to come, constructed of hard lunar granite. The space-suited figures came running when they recognized Captain Welsh and his mail car. Jerry marveled how the formerly stern expressions of the workmen brightened when the foreman handed mail out to them. "It must be fun bringing mail to men who are so far from their homes and families," Jerry said when they were on their way again. "I guess that's why I put up with the lonely hours of seeing nothing but stardust for the past 10 years, Captain Welsh answered. "But I love it, son, and I wouldn't trade jobs with any man." Their next delivery site was a cavern where men were prospecting for uranium. They, too, were overjoyed at receiving messages from home. The jeep rolled on from there to a huge plane, which was being prepared for a future spaceport. Captain Welsh and his helper dropped off another mail sack, and then they were on their way again. Some hours later, all but 2 deliveries had been made. "Next stop is the Astronomy Observatory," Captain Welsh told Jerry. They crawled over sandy hills that taxed the gripping power of their spiked wheels, wound in and out of towering buttresses of black basalt, and bored through natural tunnels like a pair of human moles. Then the observatory came to view. A smiling little scientist with thick glasses signed for the mail at the door. He invited Jerry to come back and visit the place before he returned to Earth. "You haven't seen anything until you look through their great telescope," Captain Welsh told Jerry as they drove off. "What's our last stop?" Jerry wanted to know. "A geology camp where some scientists are digging into ancient rocks," his father said. "It's only about 7 miles away, but the going will be a little rough before we get there. It's a good thing it's our last stop, because we don't have any too much oxygen left in our shoulder tanks. I usually don't take this long on a mail run." The roadway carried them through a narrow pass with a high hill of loose rock on one side and a sloping embankment on the other. Jerry's first warning of trouble came when he was flung suddenly forward. He heard the sickening drag of the wheels as he saw his father's boot hit the brakes. Just ahead of them, he saw a cascade of rocks sliding down the hill. The next moment Jerry felt an even harder blow as the jeep was grazed by one of the large boulders. The small car was swept out of the roadway like a toy and rammed against a pillar at the cliff edge. Jerry screamed in fear as he felt himself being thrown out of the car. He struck the ground hard and began rolling head over heels down the precipice. When the numbing shock of his fall had worn off, Jerry climbed dazedly to his feet and looked up the slope down which he had been thrown. "Dad!" he cried. He slipped and scrambled up the incline in reckless haste. He found Captain Welsh sprawled unconscious just below the upper brink of the precipice. Jerry knelt and looked into his face through the clear plastic helmet. His father's eyes were closed, and there was an ugly bruise on his forehead, where it must have struck the helmet as in his fall. "What am I going to do?" Jerry groaned out loud. He himself would have to make the decisions and carry them through if the 2 of them were to survive. It was a shocking thought. Then it came to him what his father had said about fear. A person need never be ashamed of fear so long as it was not permitted to get the upper hand. Jerry pulled his father up onto the roadway and tried to bring him around, but without result. Jerry examined the Jeep. One side was badly smashed, but the engine still appeared sound. The car was tipped over against the rock column. Jerry was thankful that the Jeep was only 1/6 of its earth weight on the moon. It was a tremendous effort, but he finally righted the car and got it back on the road. He jumped into the front seat and started the engine. It sputtered, then hummed into activity. Jerry studied the map on the panel. He located their present position by the giant crater, Plato, at his distant right. Then he traced the winding route leading to the geology camp. He was closer to the camp than the observatory, but ahead lay a rugged route, one with which Jerry was totally unfamiliar. He got out and went back to where Captain Welsh lay. "Which way should I go, Dad, ahead or back?" he asked helplessly, just as though his father were able to answer him. Something told him that Captain Welsh would want him to go ahead, to finish the mail run that had never missed a round in 10 years. Jerry got his father into the back seat, then gunned the Jeep and struck off for the unknown ahead. He was thankful for the old worn trail that led the way for him. It presently carried him through a gloomy valley. Jerry switched on his headlights, but the twin spheres of brightness gave him little comfort in the spooky place. Grotesque rock columns rose like menacing ghosts on both sides of him. At last he was out in the open again. The road led him around the steep ledge of a yawning crater, evidently caused by a huge crashing fireball from outer space. Jerry carefully guided the Jeep along the dangerous cliff. If one of his wheels should slip over the side, it would be a fall to frightful death 100 feet straight down. At last even this peril was past, and Jerry drove up a gradual incline over bare rock to a bluff that overlooked the distant land for many miles. "The camp!" he said joyfully. "That's it below, only a few miles away." He followed a curve that swept onto the plain below. When he was on a level again, it seemed that all his troubles were over. He felt better by the moment as he drove closer and closer to his destination. Then, without warning, his wheels began to bog down in a pumice mire. His heart did a flip-flop and he checked the map. He saw a warning to drivers to avoid this spot. In his overconfidence, he'd blundered right into it. He gave the little Jeep full power. It jerked crazily through the clinging stuff. Over to the right, the pumice seemed to thin out, and farther over he could see the roadway he should have taken. He swung his wheels to the right, and the Jeep lurched through the gray sand, using up a lot of power, but making little progress. For minutes on end, Jerry gave the Jeep all it had, and he could hear its engine laboring tiredly. Suddenly, the motor died. Jerry tried to start it again, but he could not. He checked his temperature gauge. The engine was extremely hot from the continual use of top power. From his mechanical school course, Jerry realized the rotors had frozen, and that it wouldn't run again until they'd cooled off. As he waited impatiently for the engine to cool, a warning voice in his mind was saying, "Your oxygen is getting lower by the second. If the Jeep doesn't get out of here within the next 15 minutes, you and your dad will never make it." Jerry shook off the terrible thoughts. He stamped his feet to warm them. The electric circuit in his suit seemed to be breaking down. If it collapsed completely, he would be frozen instantly by the lunar cold. Jerry massaged his dad's hands and legs in his case suit, too, which was getting colder. He worked steadily until his hands ached. Then he checked the gauge again. It was falling slowly, but heavy insulation was still keeping the engine hot. At last, Jerry decided he could not wait any longer. With a prayer on his lips, he pressed the starter button. The engine rumbled sluggishly, coughed, then quickened to full strength. He jammed the fuel pedal hard and tried to guide the Jeep's swirling, spinning motion through the lunar sand. Slowly, the little car pulled itself like a weary swimmer toward the firm bank. Finally, the wheels found good traction, and the Jeep lurched onto the roadway. Jerry heaved a tremendous sigh and sped down the path toward the geology camp. Less than an hour later, Jerry was being permitted into the room of one of the huts where his father had been carried for examination by the camp physician. Jerry had been told that his father had suffered a slight concussion, but that he would be all right. Captain Welsh smiled from his cot as Jerry walked in. "Hi, spaceman," his father greeted. "The doctor says the men here were mighty happy to get their mail on time." "I'm glad I came on here, then, instead of going back to the observatory," Jerry murmured. "You did the job in the best tradition of the space mail service, Jerry," Captain Welsh said, smiling proudly. "If I had any doubts that you'd be able to follow me some day, son, they're gone now." Jerry nodded happily. A few doubts had been removed from his own mind in the past hour. The end. And our second story today, by the same author, is called All Aboard for Space, by Richard M. Elan. It had already been a wonderful birthday for the twins, Sue and Steve Shannon, when their father asked, "How about it, kids? Are you ready for that space ride I promised?" Sue's big hazel eyes looked like walnuts as she stared in surprise. Steve's blue eyes were more like plums. Could they really believe what they were hearing? "I said I'd take you on the ride when you two reached 12, didn't I?" Mr. Shannon went on. They hadn't forgotten, and were suddenly as excited as two young ducks who have just discovered water. Mr. Shannon looked at his watch. "We'd better get ready. The next flight is at 4 o'clock. Less than half an hour later, Mrs. Shannon was bidding goodbye to the three as they climbed into the family helicopter on the roof of their home. In this year of 2004, nearly everybody owned a copter. Mrs. Shannon had been invited to go along, but she said no coaxing in the world would get her to go up in one of those rocket things. The overhead doors of the garage swung open as Mrs. Shannon pushed the button on the wall. As soon as the three riders were comfortably seated, Mr. Shannon started up the engine, and the overhead blade began churning. Gently, the copter lifted into the blue sky and headed out over the city. "I can't believe we're really going to take a trip to space," Sue said happily. "Someday I'm going to be a spaceman and travel to all the planets," Steve declared. The plane passed over beautiful triple-decked highways, over green farms loaded with scientific equipment and solar mirrors, over plastic-domed skyscrapers. Presently, a large oval appeared just ahead. "There's the spaceport!" Sue exclaimed. When Mr. Shannon got the signal to land, he brought the helicopter down into the parking lot at the edge of the port. Then the three of them jumped out onto the ground. As they walked toward the main building, the twins excitedly noticed the busy activity of the field. What impressed them most were the massive torpedo-shaped rockets, which were half buried in their concrete launching pits. "Where's the biggest rocket going, Dad?" Steve asked. When his father said it was going to the moon, a tingle raced up the boy's spine, and all at once he wished he could be on the ship himself. "There's our rocket over there," Mr. Shannon said, pointing to a smaller craft of lightweight beryllium metal just across the way. Near the pit was a sign that read, "Space rides daily. Enjoy the thrill of a lifetime, 1,000 miles above Earth." Mr. Shannon got their tickets. Then, after a heart checkup, they waited in line with the other eager sightseers. Finally, the spaceport officer took down the chain that held back the crowd and permitted them to approach the rocket. They had to cross a bridge to get from the pit edge to the ship. As they crossed, Steve looked down into the hot pit and saw clouds of flame and smoke pouring from the great jet tubes. In the ship, the Shannons were given couch numbers in a large room with the rest of their companions. Then a steward came around with a special candy, which he told the passengers to eat to prevent their getting sick. Next, everyone were issued queer-looking shoes with metal soles. "What are these for, Dad?" Sue wanted to know. She saw her father and brother exchange winks. "She'll find out, won't she?" Mr. Shannon teased. As Steve and Sue lay on their soft couches and fastened plastic belts across their bodies, their father explained the purpose of this. "We'll blast off at a pretty fast speed, and if you weren't buckled down, we'd be thrown about and hurt." When the moment of the blast-off came, Steve and Sue went through the most exciting experience of their lives. A loud roar filled their ears, and it felt suddenly as if the bottom of their stomachs had dropped out. They were pressed deeply into their couches, and they had the feeling of being flattened out as though under the foot of an elephant. Then slowly, Steve and Sue felt the awful weight lifting from them, and finally it was gone altogether. "Ugh!" Sue groaned dizzily, unstrapping herself as the others were doing. What happened? When she tried to walk, she understood the purpose of the metal-soled shoes. "We scarcely weigh anything now," their father explained. "The magnetism of our shoe soles is the only thing that keeps us from floating about like a feather." The guide, who said his name was Mr. Quinlan, led the sightseers to a huge window. The young Shannons gasped in wonder at what they saw. The sky was nearly pitch black and filled with more burning lights than they even guessed could exist. "We're about 1,000 miles above the earth," Mr. Quinlan said. "We're out of the earth's atmosphere, and that's why the sky is dark and the stars so brilliant. Our rear jets are thrusting just barely enough to keep us from being pulled back down to earth." The guide next said that they would go outside the ship in space suits. Sue and Steve whooped for joy, for they had not expected this. Mr. Quinlan distributed space gear from a cabinet. Then he explained how they were to put it on. After the flexible suits and plastic helmets were donned, everyone turned on his oxygen, which came from shoulder tanks. The others looked to Steve like balloon toys inflated with air, and he had to laugh as they waddled about. The tourists were led out of a side door onto a balcony which resembled a large fire escape. Everyone was told to buckle himself to the rail by a short length of cord in front of him. "If one of us were to lose contact with the ship," Mr. Shannon warned his son and daughter, "you'd go drifting off into space." Sue and Steve shuddered at the thought of this. Mr. Quinlan pointed out whirls of misty clouds that were called nebulas. He also showed them star clusters and the brighter planets. The sightseers had a close-up view of the earth that looked like a shimmering green ball. The guide did his speaking through a small radio attached to his suit. Each tourist had a receiver in his helmet through which he could listen. For almost a full hour, Sue and Steve, together with the other spellbound passengers, took in the splendor of this strange, silent place, the vastness of which staggered the imagination. "Isn't this a wonderful tribute to the greatness of God's creation?" Mr. Shannon said to his children. Steve and Sue had to agree with him wholeheartedly. When Mr. Quinlan was ready to go back into the ship, he tried the outdoor switch, but the door failed to open. Over his two-way radio circuit, the passengers could hear a worried discussion between him and the pilot inside. They learned that a tube of compressed air which operated the outer door was jammed. There was nothing that could be done about it from the inside. Some of the women began sobbing, believing they would never return to Earth again. Mr. Shannon looked at his son and daughter anxiously. "Keep your chins up, kids," he said. "Nothing was ever gained by people losing their heads. I'm sure they'll figure out some way to save us." I'm not afraid, Dad," Steve said bravely. There were tears of fright in Sue's brown eyes, but her small chin was courageously set as if she would not permit herself to give in to terror that she really felt. "You're brave ones," their father said, putting his big arms around their shoulders. Mr. Quinlan approached the Shannons. "Mr. Shannon," he said, "I've got something important to talk over with you and your son." The two listened closely as the guide outlined a daring plan. He pointed to a small, circular opening some 10 feet above the platform. He said that if a person could climb into the opening, he could turn an emergency valve that would double the air pressure and clear the jammed tube. Since Steve was the only boy on the platform and therefore the smallest, Mr. Quinlan wanted to know if Steve would try it. Steve felt his heart fluttering crazily. He was both afraid and excited. "There's only one danger, son," the guide pointed out. "You'll have to unfasten your safety line. If you think you can keep calm, though, there should be no real risk." "What will happen if the job isn't done?" Mr. Shannon asked grimly. Mr. Quinlan shrugged. "There's not much that can be done. These suits will run out of oxygen in 20 minutes, and only our boy is slim enough to get inside the opening. Then, too, they can't land the ship without risk of tossing us all out." Mr. Shannon said quietly to Steve, "It's up to you, son, if you believe you can go through with it without losing your head and getting thrown from the ship." Steve swallowed hard, thinking of the lives of others around him that depended on him. "I'll try it," he managed to say. He felt his knees go weak when the safety rope was unfastened from his waist, and he realized there was nothing now but his magnetic shoes to hold him to the ship. Carefully, Mr. Quinlan boosted him upward toward the opening above. Tick, tick, tick went his metal soles against the shiny skin of the craft as he made his way upward by means of special climbing handles on the rocket hull. "Keep calm," he told himself. "A spaceman doesn't lose his head." He was thankful for the firm grip of his gloves as his fingers closed about the sides of the chamber and he pulled himself up inside. It was a close fit, even for him. Mr. Quinlan had told him that usually the emergency valve was easily reached from the deck above, but that during this trip the deck was closed off for repairs and couldn't be entered. Steve found the valve handle and turned it as he was instructed. Almost immediately he heard the deafening blast of many voices in his receiver. Among the words he heard were, "The door's opening!" Steve sighed deeply and carefully started down again. But the danger was not over yet. He still had to be very cautious. This was brought to him sickeningly when he drew his foot back with greater force than usual and found himself weaving backward into space. With a chill of terror, he grabbed the climbing handle and pulled himself snug against the ship's hull again. Finally he felt the strong arms of his father on the lower part of his legs. He relaxed and was helped down onto the platform amid the cheers of everyone around. The sightseers, sobered by their close call, trooped silently back into the ship. A moment later the craft began dropping earthward, its jets acting as brakes to check the rapid descent. After landing, the Shannons were called into the office of the Chief of Operations at the spaceport. "Young man," the chief said to Steve, "let me congratulate you for the brave thing you did." He offered his hand, and Steve felt a flush of pride as he took the big palm in his own. "Such an unselfish deed can never be fully repaid," the chief went on. "Tell me, Steve, do you like space going?" Steve's eyes glowed with stars. "Very much, sir," he said. "Someday I'm going to become a spaceman myself." "Then this little reward we have for you and your sister may help you reach your goal." He held out a plastic-sealed card. Steve took it as his heart raced. It was a lifetime rocket pass. The end. Thanks for listening to Short Stories with Mrs. Sam. I hope you were entertained by today's stories and that you join me next week. Short Stories with Mrs. Sam is brought to you by the Hotchkiss Library of Sharon and Robin Hood Radio and can be heard each week on Sunday mornings, 8:30 a.m. here on WHDD 91.9 FM. All the sounds used in this episode are from freesound.org.